In March 29, 1942, one man vanished into the smoke of the most daring raid of the war. The night the docks of St. Nazaire burned, the world thought Commander Arthur Hale died with them. The raid had been madness from the start, a single destroyer packed with explosives racing up the Loire River straight into the jaws of the German U-boat base. Hale had led a small team ashore to destroy the pumping station. The explosion that followed shook the sea itself. When the survivors fled, Hale was not among them. For weeks, London believed him gone, one more name on a long list of the lost. But Arthur Hale was not dead. He awoke half buried in soot and dust, ribs aching, one arm broken, the smell of diesel and burnt flesh heavy in the air. He had been thrown clear when the charge went off. Around him, the base roared with confusion. Sirens, shouts, boots. Through the cracks of shattered concrete, he could see German soldiers running like ants. He should have died there. Instead, something colder, quieter took hold of him. He crawled into the dark. Days blurred together in the belly of that monster. The U-boat pens of St. Nazaire were not just docks. They were cathedrals of war, built of concrete thicker than faith itself. The Germans thought them indestructible, and inside those grey walls, in the ducts and crawl spaces meant for air and wiring, Hale found his tomb and his refuge. He learned the rhythms of the place, the clang of hammers at dawn, the echo of boots at inspection, the hiss of the welding torches that sang like cicadas in summer. When he could, he stole. Bread from an open crate, a flask from a careless officer, a small knife from a mechanic's belt. He drank water from the condensation dripping down the ducts. It wasn't courage that kept him alive, it was guilt. He had ordered men to die on that raid. Every night he heard them in his dreams, their voices fading beneath the roar of explosions. So he whispered back into the dark, promising them something. A vengeance that would last longer than any bullet. The first act came by accident. He was crawling through a ventilation shaft above Dock 3 when he dropped a screw. It fell into an open circuit box below, shorting the system. The lights flickered, then died. Sparks flew, and the German foreman cursed loudly. Hale froze. The blackout delayed the launch of 2 U-boats for nearly a day. The Germans never found the cause. That night, Hale smiled for the first time in weeks. He began to test the limits of his new shadow world. He memorized patrol routes, he marked which rooms the officers used, he found the storerooms stacked with oil drums and fuses, and one night when the base slept, he crept down and loosened the bolts on the rail lines that carried torpedoes from the workshop to the pens. The next morning, a torpedo trolley jumped the track, shattered, and set off a small fire. The Germans blamed careless workers, the workers blamed sabotage. And the whispers began. Someone unseen was haunting the base. Within a month, the legend was born. They called it Der Geist von St. Nazaire, the ghost of St. Nazaire. Officers mocked it at first. Then one, a proud lieutenant, was found dead, drowned in a flooded corridor after the pump system mysteriously reversed flow. Hale had done it by swapping a single pair of wires. Soon, every creak of metal or hiss of steam made men glance over their shoulders. Some claimed they heard footsteps in the walls. Others swore they saw a figure moving through the fog on the docks. Hale used their fear like a weapon. He moved only when the alarms blared or when the foghorns drowned sound. He left small traces, a boot print in the wrong direction, a ration tin placed neatly on an officer's desk. Little reminders that something, someone, watched them. The Germans doubled their guards. They searched the base top to bottom. They never found him. By June, Hale had become something more than human to them. A rumor, a story whispered in mess halls and barracks. Men refused to go alone into the lower levels. Work slowed, repairs dragged. But Hale's body was failing. His left arm had healed crooked. He coughed blood sometimes. His beard had grown wild. Yet he kept his promise, not just to the dead, but to himself. He began to plan something bigger. He knew the U-boat U-593 was scheduled to depart for the Atlantic in 2 days. He had overheard the engineers talking. The boat carried new radar equipment meant to track Allied convoys. If he could destroy it, it would mean hundreds of lives saved. So on a stormy night, while thunder drowned the world, he climbed into the dockyard's lower maintenance shaft. He carried with him a single stolen detonator and a small charge, the kind used for welding ignition. He placed it under the power console that controlled the pen's gates. As he slipped back into the shadows, he whispered, "For Dunkirk, for the men who didn't come home." When the U-boat's engines started, the gate opened, then jammed halfway. The charge went off, not as an explosion, but as a flare of sparks and molten wire. Power cascaded through the system, burning out the motors. The gates slammed shut. The submarine was trapped. The Germans went wild, shouting, running, shooting at shadows. Hale, hidden above them in the vents, smiled through cracked lips. They would never believe it was one man. They would believe what they already feared, that their base was cursed. That night, as the storm raged outside, Hale lay in the dark, listening to the chaos below. He pressed his hand to the cold concrete and whispered again to the men he'd lost. "I kept my promise. I buried them, all of them, right here." And from somewhere deep inside the U-boat pens, a single light flickered, then died. The ghost of St. Nazaire vanished once more into the walls, unseen, unheard, but never forgotten. June the 17th in 1942, the base at St. Nazaire had stopped sleeping. The ghost had taken its breath. By the middle of June, the Germans at St. Nazaire were cracking. Men whispered that the air itself carried voices, that the walls groaned with the weight of souls. Some refused to enter the flooded lower levels. Others crossed themselves before walking past the old pump room. The commandant, Captain Erich Voss, didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in failure. And failure in Hitler's navy meant a bullet or a rope. So he summoned the SS. They arrived 3 days later. 2 black cars rolling through the gates under a grey sky. Out stepped Sturmbannführer Dieter Reinhardt, tall, sharp as the blade on his collar. He carried a briefcase and a riding crop, though no horse in sight. He looked around the base, sniffed the air like a wolf, and said only, "Let's find your ghost." Arthur Hale heard them before he saw them. From his hiding place above the command office, a narrow vent smelling of oil and dust, he could see everything through a thin crack in the grate. The SS man's boots clicked like metronomes. Reinhardt listened more than he spoke, letting silence hang heavy. He ordered a sweep of every corridor, every storeroom, every maintenance tunnel. Guards dragged mirrors, flashlights and dogs. But Hale knew the base better than any of them now. He had mapped it in his head, every echo, every pipe, every creak of the metal floor. He was the ghost they hunted, and they were his orchestra. That night, he moved. He crawled through the ventilation system above the living quarters, careful not to breathe too loud. He'd found a loose wire running to the public address speakers, the same ones used for alarms. With a small twist of the copper ends and a scavenged battery, he made the wires hum. Not words, not yet, just low, pulsing static, a heartbeat that rolled through the halls. At midnight, the men awoke to the sound of whispers rising through the loudspeakers, a hiss. Then a voice. Not clear enough to understand, just enough. to make the hair on their necks rise. "He's here, in the walls." By dawn, 2 guards had deserted. One shot himself in the arm, claiming the voice ordered it. Reinhardt did not flinch. He gathered the officers in the command room and said coldly, "This is no ghost. It is a man, and I will find him." He set traps, small tripwires across hallways, baited rations left in dark corners, patrols that changed routes every hour. But Hale was patient. He watched, he listened, and when they left their food on a crate as bait, he took only the salt. He left the bread and meat untouched, but wrote a single word in dust beside it. "Closer." Reinhardt began to break the base apart piece by piece. He ordered engineers to shut down half the ventilation system, sealing off shafts Hale used to move. The air grew thick. The smell of oil turned to rot. Hale felt the walls closing in. For the first time in months, fear clawed at him. His lungs ached, his ribs throbbed, and his mind buzzed with the thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I am a ghost already. Then in the darkness of a sealed vent, he found something. An old French newspaper wedged behind a broken panel. From before the war. The date was 1939. He held it close, tracing the faded ink, the photograph of a sunny beach. For a moment, he remembered the world before Dunkirk, before guilt, and that tiny spark of humanity gave him a new idea. If they wanted to hear a ghost, he'd give them one. That night, during the shift change, he slipped down into the generator room. He knew the guards rotated every 30 minutes. He had exactly 8 to work. He unscrewed a panel and attached a wire to the loudspeaker line. Then he used a broken microphone he'd scavenged days earlier. It barely worked, but it was enough. At 2:47 a.m., when the base lights flickered, the voice came again, this time over every speaker, a whisper that sounded like wind through a graveyard. "You left us in the water. We remember." The German soldiers froze. Some fell to their knees. Others fired blindly at shadows. Reinhardt shouted orders, but his voice drowned beneath the storm of panic. Hale cut the line and vanished into the vents. By morning, the SS had sealed the generator room and posted armed guards. But the damage was done. The ghost was no longer a rumor. He was real. Reinhardt's composure began to crack. He demanded records from Berlin. He wanted every list of captured saboteurs, every report from the raid in March. When the names came, he stared at one for a long time. Commander Arthur Hale, presumed killed in action. The SS officer closed the file slowly, his eyes narrowing. "A man who should be dead," he said. "Perhaps he is." He began speaking of purging the curse, burning the lower levels, flooding the tunnels with gas. When Hale heard that, he knew his time was almost over. He had to strike first, one final act that would make sure they never rebuilt the base again. The next night, he moved through the vents toward the storage wing, where barrels of aviation fuel were stacked like tombs. He carried one of his stolen detonators, now rigged with a delay fuse made from his pocket watch spring. He placed it between 2 barrels, whispered a short prayer, and turned to crawl away. Then he froze. Below him, standing in the doorway, was Reinhardt, alone, holding a flashlight, staring directly at the vent. "I know you're there, Commander Hale," the SS man said quietly. "You are not a ghost. You are a coward hiding in dust." Silence. Hale didn't move. Reinhardt's lips curled into a smile. "Come out, and I'll give you a clean death." The commander's heart pounded. He thought of the men at Dunkirk, of the promise he'd made. Then he whispered, just loud enough for Reinhardt to hear, "Ghosts don't die." And he triggered the fuse. Reinhardt's scream was lost in the thunder. The explosion tore through the fuel depot like judgment itself. Flames shot up into the night, painting the sky over Nazaire red. The base burned for 2 days. When German reinforcements finally entered, they found no body, just ashes, twisted steel, and the shattered remains of a pocket watch stopped at 3:01 a.m. They said the ghost was gone, but the men who stayed after swore they could still hear, on quiet nights, the faint tick of a watch somewhere deep inside the walls. August 14, 1942, the ruins of Saint-Nazaire, France. The fire had died weeks ago, but the echoes hadn't. They said the base was cursed. The German engineers refused to go inside after dusk. Even in daylight, the shadows seemed to hum, a faint, mechanical rhythm that no one could trace. At first, it was dismissed as wind, then as rats in the ducts. But one night, a sentry swore he heard voices coming from the underground radio room. Men speaking English, faint and distorted, repeating coordinates that led nowhere. By morning, the rumor had spread through the garrison. The Geist von Saint-Nazaire was still talking. Berlin didn't believe in ghosts, but they did believe in unexplained signals. Within days, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, dispatched a small team of radio specialists to investigate. Their leader was Major Friedrich Adler, a meticulous man with sharp features and a sharper temper. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, and hated superstition more than he hated the British. When his staff officer mentioned the local soldiers' fear, Adler snapped, "Ghosts don't send transmissions, machines do, and I will find which one." The investigation began at dawn. Adler's team brought equipment, spectrum analyzers, code books, and recording reels. They combed through the bombed tunnels, trailing wires and listening devices. But what they found made no sense. The phantom signal shifted frequencies at random intervals, too precise to be natural, too chaotic to be human. Every time they traced it to a location, it moved. Once it seemed to come from the generator room, then from the ventilation shafts, then from deep under the dry docks where no power cables remained. Each time they heard the same faint pattern. 3 short pulses. One long, one short. Adler's assistant said, "Sir, it could be a residual transmission from Allied equipment left behind." Adler frowned. Residuals don't change frequency every 6 hours. That night, Adler stayed behind after his men had gone. He set up a single receiver by the collapsed radio station and waited, headphones over his ears. Hours passed, nothing but static. Then, at 02:37 a.m., the signal returned. Soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Tick, tick. Pause. Tick, tick. His hand trembled as he reached for his logbook. And then a voice, distorted, barely audible, but unmistakably English. "Ghost! Standing by!" Adler froze. He leaned closer. The voice repeated, slower this time. "Ghost! Standing by!" Then silence. By morning, Adler looked like he hadn't slept in days. He sent an urgent telegram to Berlin. "Unidentified Allied signal active within ruins, possibly automated relay. Request permission to dismantle site completely." Berlin denied the request. They wanted the base operational again. Too much steel, too much money invested. Frustrated, Adler ordered his men to begin demolition anyway, unofficially. If there was a hidden transmitter, he would bury it under concrete and end the nonsense once and for all. But the men refused. The workers were terrified. One of them, a young corporal named Keller, claimed that while cleaning the old fuel chambers, he found a handprint scorched into a bulkhead. The metal was blackened, shaped like a human palm pressed into fire. Another swore he saw lights flicker in a room with no power cables. When Adler slapped him and ordered him to get back to work, the soldier said nothing, just handed the major his rifle and walked away. Within days, half the repair crew deserted. Meanwhile, across the channel, Evelyn Cross sat in a dim Bletchley Park office listening to intercepted German reports. She had become obsessed with the St. Nazaire transmissions. For weeks, British intelligence had been picking up a faint pulse from the French coast. It wasn't German, it wasn't Allied, it was the same pattern she'd heard in the tunnels. 3 short, 1 long, 1 short. "Commander Hale's still talking," she whispered. Her superior frowned. "Miss Cross, that's impossible. The man died in the explosion." She shook her head. Not his voice, his signal. The code breakers gave the phenomenon a name, the phantom frequency. Every night it pulsed through the static, always the same pattern, always originating near the ruins of Saint Nazaire. But then something changed. On August 23rd, the transmission began including faint background sounds, machinery, dripping water, and footsteps. And once, just once, a human breath. When Evelyn played the recording in slow motion, she swore she heard words beneath the static. "Watch the tide, it comes again." Back in France, Major Adler was losing his grip. He ordered every piece of British equipment collected and destroyed. He sealed the lower tunnels with explosives, despite direct orders not to. And yet, the signal kept coming. Every morning his technicians would report, "Transmission active again, sir." He smashed a radio in rage, "And it's coming from nowhere." The men stopped meeting his eyes. Some began crossing themselves before entering the bunker. One evening, while Adler reviewed his notes, he found something odd. Every recorded signal, when plotted on paper, formed a pattern, not random at all. It was a clock face. Each new broadcast added one more mark, like a hand moving forward. The next tick was due at midnight. That night the base fell silent. No voices, no footsteps, no static. Adler waited by the generator, revolver in hand, eyes fixed on the receiver. At exactly 00, the signal returned, louder than ever. He ripped off his headphones and stared at the device. The dial glowed red, the wires shaking as if alive. Then came the voice. This time, clear as day. "Time's up." And then, the fuel depot detonated. The explosion ripped through the harbour, sending waves that reached the far docks. German patrol boats capsized. The radio tower collapsed. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the transmitter. 3 days later, Berlin received a final report from Saint Nazaire. It contained only one line, unsigned, "The ghost has stopped the clock." The phantom frequency was never heard again, but the British archives would later note one last intercepted pulse, faint and distorted, recorded a week after the blast. Evelyn played it over and over, tears in her eyes. It said, simply, "Mission complete. May 1967, Saint Nazaire, France." 25 years after the explosion that silenced the base. The harbour was quiet now. Fishermen cast their nets where warships once moored. Children rode bicycles along cracked concrete that had once been drenched in oil and blood. The old U-boat pens stood like giants of another age, vast, cold, and half forgotten. To most, they were ruins. To a few, they were ghosts. That morning, a team of French engineers arrived to begin restoration. They were tasked with converting the remains into a maritime museum. Among them was Jean Morel, a structural specialist barely 30 years old, too young to remember the war, but old enough to feel its weight in the air. As he walked through the tunnels, his boots echoed off the damp walls. The light from his torch danced across the rusted rebar and the faded German stencils. Vorsicht, Kraftstoff. Every sound came back twice, once from the stone and once from the past. They started in Section C, the the area sealed after the 1942 blast. The Germans had poured concrete over the damage before their retreat, leaving behind thick slabs that no one had disturbed in decades. Jean's foreman wiped sweat from his brow. "This part's not on any of the maps," he said. "We'll cut through here." The saw bit into the wall, shrieking like a siren. For hours they worked, layer by layer. Then suddenly the blade hit empty air, a hollow space. They stopped. The smell that drifted out wasn't rot, but dust, the still air of a room untouched since the war. Jean climbed through the opening first, torch in hand. The beam swept over a small chamber. Metal pipes, broken shelves, a rusted cot. And on the wall, drawn in chalk, a single word: time. At the center of the room sat a table covered in soot. On it, resting on a cracked leather map case, was a pocket watch. It was enormous. Brass casing, intricate gears exposed through a glass pane. The hands had stopped at WW2. Jean picked it up carefully. Despite the dust, the mechanism inside was pristine. And when he tilted it toward the light, something flickered. A hidden compartment. Inside lay a folded scrap of parchment, brittle but legible. It read, "If you are reading this, then the war is over. Let it stay that way." H.H. Jean frowned. H.H.? The foreman shrugged. Probably a German officer. But Jean wasn't convinced. He had studied the archives. He knew of Operation Chariot, the 1942 raid, and of the rumours that followed. A British commander missing, presumed dead, a so-called ghost who sabotaged the base from within. The initials matched the name in the report, Commander Arthur Hale. That evening, Jean took the watch home. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than a timepiece. He sat by the window of his small flat, the Loire River glimmering outside, and began to tinker. The mechanism was far too complex for an ordinary watch. Dozens of tiny cogs, magnets, and a coiled copper wire wound beneath the mainspring, like the inside of a radio. When he turned the crown, the gears clicked, and faintly, ever so faintly, a sound emerged, a rhythm, 3 short, 1 long, 1 short. Jean froze. He knew Morse code. It spelled a single letter. G, he tried again, 3 short, 1 long, 1 short, G for ghost. Over the next week, he became obsessed. He spent nights dismantling and reassembling the watch, tracing each circuit. He discovered a crystal microphone hidden under the faceplate, a spool of thin wire coiled behind the spring, a miniature recorder, impossibly advanced, for 1942. It wasn't meant to keep time, it was meant to remember. Jean connected the device to an old signal reader from his workshop. Static hissed through the speakers. Then a faint voice, weak but distinct. "If this reaches you, tell them the docks are clear, the tide comes again." The rest dissolved into static. Jean sat there for a long time, the voice echoing in his mind. He contacted the British Embassy in Paris. They were skeptical at first, but when he mentioned the initials and the recording, everything changed. Within a week, 2 officers from the Royal Navy Historical Branch arrived. They handled the watch with reverence, like a relic. One of them, Captain Ross, listened to the playback. His face went pale. "That's Hale," he whispered. "That's his voice. We thought he burned with the demolition charges." He looked up at Jean. "You found him." A month later, Jean was invited to Portsmouth for a ceremony. The watch had been authenticated and placed on display beside a plaque. Commander Arthur Hale, 1905-1942. The ghost of Saint Nazaire, he stopped the clock so others could keep time. As the band played softly, veterans stood in silence. Some saluted. Others simply bowed their heads. Jean watched the old men's faces. Those who had lived through the war, who had lost friends in raids and rescues, who had spent their lives trying to forget. And in that quiet hall, he felt something he couldn't name, not pride, not sadness, but a kind of peace. Later that night, long after the crowds had gone, Jing lingered near the exhibit. The watch ticked again, faint, uneven, like a heartbeat coming back to life. He leaned closer. For a moment he thought he heard something beneath the ticking, a whisper in the gears, the trace of a man who'd lived between walls and shadows. Mission complete. Jean smiled. He didn't know if it was memory, imagination, or the last echo of a ghost refusing to fade. But as he left the museum, the bells of the harbour chimed midnight, and somewhere deep inside the glass case, the watch clicked once more, 3 short, 1 long, 1 short, the signature of the man who wasn't there.